I was just a hotel manager. She was the most powerful woman in the room. But when she pressed a crumpled note into his hand and whispered, "They're going to kill me tonight," everything changed. If you've ever wondered what one ordinary man can do against a $1 billion conspiracy, stay until the end, because this story will shake you. Subscribe now so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments. What city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The Alderton Grand Hotel had a way of making people feel small. It wasn't the height of the ceilings, though they stretched 40 feet above the marble lobby floor. It wasn't the chandeliers, each one imported from a glassworks in Venice and worth more than most people's homes. It was something subtler, the deliberate architecture of wealth, the way every surface whispered that some people belonged here and most people didn't. Mason Brooks belonged to the second category, and he'd made peace with that a long time ago. He stood near the service entrance to the grand ballroom, dressed in his operations manager uniform, navy jacket, gold name tag, earpiece connecting him to the security desk, watching 400 of the city's richest people congratulate themselves on their generosity. The Hawthorne Foundation's annual charity gala raised millions every year. It also gave wealthy people an excuse to wear things that cost more than Mason's monthly salary and call it philanthropy. He didn't resent them for it. He'd stopped wasting energy on resentment years ago. "Brooks." His earpiece crackled. It was Danny from the front desk. "We've got a situation near the coat check. Guest says someone walked off with her wrap. Tell her we'll review the camera footage first thing tomorrow morning. She's pretty insistent." "I'm sure she is." Mason straightened his jacket and started moving. "Tell her I'm on my way." He navigated through the ballroom's outer corridor, past a string quartet playing something classical that nobody was really listening to, past a row of framed photographs documenting 40 years of Hawthorne Foundation charity work. He recognized Victoria Hawthorne in a few of them, younger in the older photos, always standing slightly apart from the crowd, even when she was surrounded by people. He'd seen her in person only twice before tonight. Once when she'd toured the hotel's event spaces 6 weeks ago to personally approve the gala's layout. She'd asked sharp, specific questions and taken notes by hand, which surprised him. Billionaires usually sent assistants for that kind of thing. The second time had been earlier this evening, when she'd arrived and paused at the ballroom entrance for just a moment longer than necessary, like she was steeling herself before walking into something difficult. He'd noticed that. He noticed things like that. Old habit, hard to kill. The coat check situation turned out to be a misunderstanding. The woman's wrap had been placed on the wrong hook by a new staff member and was recovered in under 3 minutes. Mason apologized twice, meant it once, and was heading back toward the ballroom when he nearly collided with someone moving fast around a corner. He caught her by the arm out of instinct, steadied her, and found himself looking at Victoria Hawthorne from a distance of approximately 8 inches. She was not the composed, immaculate CEO he'd seen in photographs. Her jaw was tight. There was something moving behind her eyes that he recognized immediately because he'd felt it himself more times than he cared to count. Fear. Controlled, but barely. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was steady. That impressed him more than he expected. "I wasn't watching where I was going. No damage done." He released her arm. "Are you all right, Ms. Hawthorne?" A flash of something crossed her face. Surprise, maybe, that he knew who she was. Then her expression smoothed back into the polished neutrality of someone who'd spent years being watched. "Of course," she said. "Long evening." She moved a step past him. Then she stopped. He watched her make a decision. He could see it happening. The small war behind her eyes. The calculation. The moment she chose to trust a complete stranger because she'd run out of other options. She turned back toward him. Her right hand came up and pressed something into his palm. Folded paper. Small. The kind torn from a pocket notebook. Her fingers were ice cold. "Don't read it here," she said quietly. Her eyes moved past him, scanning the corridor in both directions. "Please." And then she walked away, back toward the ballroom, chin up, shoulders straight, the picture of a woman without a care in the world. Mason stood there for 3 seconds. Then he walked to the nearest single-occupancy restroom, locked the door behind him, and unfolded the note. The handwriting was small and precise. Someone used to writing quickly and clearly. "My COO Richard Calloway is going to have me killed tonight. He has armed men inside the hotel. I have evidence on a flash drive in my clutch. Recordings, financial records, proof of 6 years of fraud, and my father's murder. I can't call police. He has people there too. I don't know who I can trust. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. But I've been watching you work tonight, and you move like someone who knows how to handle bad situations. If I'm wrong about you, please just pretend you never read this and I'll figure something out. If I'm not wrong, I'll be near the East Service exit at 9:45. I won't be there long. V. Mason read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his jacket pocket, and looked at himself in the mirror for a long moment. His face was the same face that had stared back at him from mirrors in Afghanistan, in Djibouti, in 3 different hospitals, and in the bathroom of his apartment on the night he'd decided to stop being whatever the Navy had made him and start being someone his daughter could actually know. 43 stitches of memories. 1 reconstructed knee. 2 years of nightmares that had slowly, over time, turned into just regular dreams. He was a hotel operations manager. He had an 8-year-old daughter named Lily, who was at home right now with Mrs. Carver from next door, probably asleep by now, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, the way it always was. He thought about Lily for exactly 4 seconds. Then he pulled out his personal cell phone and sent a text to Sophia Bennett that read, "Need you. Bring your kit. I'll explain when you get here. Use the loading dock entrance on Mercer Street." Sophia's reply came back in under a minute. "On my way. You'd better have coffee." I was at the East Service exit at 9:38. 7 minutes early, because that's how he'd been trained. And some things you couldn't untrain no matter how many years you spent pretending to be ordinary. The service corridor behind the ballroom was a different world from the gleaming event spaces above. Concrete floors, exposed pipe, fluorescent lighting that flickered slightly at the far end. It smelled like industrial cleaning solution and something faintly metallic. Mason had walked every inch of this building in his first 2 weeks on the job. He knew where every camera was, every exit, every space where the fancy architecture gave way to the ugly infrastructure that kept it running. He heard her before he saw her. Not footsteps. She was moving quietly, which meant she was either naturally careful or she'd had someone teach her. But there was the soft sound of fabric against the wall as she pressed close to it, and then she came around the corner and stopped when she saw him. She'd left her heels somewhere. Bare feet on concrete. Smart. "You actually came," she said. "I said I would." "You didn't say anything." "I was here." He kept his voice low, his eyes moving past her down the corridor. "Is the flash drive still with you?" She touched her clutch. A small movement, controlled. "Yes." "Good. How many men did you see?" She blinked. He watched her recalibrate, shift from the surprise of him being there to the practical reality of what came next. He appreciated that she was fast about it. "2 that I could identify for certain," she said, "both in event staff uniforms, one near the main entrance, one circulating the room. But Richard, Calloway, he had his phone out twice in the last hour, and both times he looked directly at me after. I think he was coordinating something." "Did Calloway know you saw the evidence?" A pause. Shorter than he expected. "I found the files on a server I wasn't supposed to access," she said. "My IT director tipped me off 3 days ago, told me something was wrong, and then stopped answering my messages. I don't think Richard knows exactly what I found, but he knows I found something. He's been watching me differently for 2 days." "What does differently mean?" "Like I'm a problem he's already planning to solve." Mason nodded once. "Okay, there's a freight elevator at the end of this corridor, takes us to the sublevel, hotel utility spaces, laundry, mechanical rooms. We can move through the building without using any public-facing areas. I have someone coming to help us with the drive." "Who?" "Someone I trust." He said it without hesitation because it was true and because this wasn't the moment for complicated explanations. "Can you move quickly?" She looked down at her feet on the concrete floor. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face. Dry, humorless, the expression of a person who'd passed the point of finding anything funny but hadn't lost their sense of the absurd. "I left my shoes in the ballroom," she said. "I don't think I'm going back for them." "There's a lost and found cabinet near the laundry room. We'll find you something." He moved and she followed, and they were 20 feet down the corridor when he heard it. The sound of a door opening back the way they'd come, and the low sound of a voice, someone speaking quietly into a radio. He touched Victoria's arm without looking at her, and pointed left toward a supply alcove between two banks of shelving units. She was already moving before his hand dropped back to his side. They pressed back into the shadows as two men in event staff uniforms moved past the alcove entrance, flashlights cutting through the fluorescent dimness. One of them speaking in a low and efficient voice. "She's not in the ballroom. Check the service levels." The other one said something too quiet to catch. They moved past without stopping. Mason counted to 7. Then he touched Victoria's shoulder. "We go." And they moved. The hotel's mechanical sublevel was a maze that Mason had mapped in his head over 18 months on the job. He'd done it unconsciously at first, the way he cataloged spaces and exits without really meaning to, an old reflex that civilian life had never quite extinguished. Later, he'd done it deliberately, walking the corridors on slow Tuesday afternoons when the building was quiet and he had nothing better to do. He told himself it was professionalism. Good operations management meant knowing your building. He'd never expected to be grateful for it in exactly this way. He found a pair of rubber kitchen clogs in the lost and found cabinet, 2 sizes too large, bright orange, the kind the dishwashing staff used. Victoria looked at them for one beat, then put them on without comment. He'd been watching her in small pieces since the corridor, cataloging the same way he cataloged buildings. Not the polished CEO from the photographs, but the person underneath, the one making rapid decisions while managing what must have been genuine terror. She hadn't cried, hadn't frozen. When he'd pointed into that alcove, she'd moved clean and fast, no hesitation, no questions. She was used to being composed under pressure. It was trained into her the way his own instincts were trained into him, just by a different kind of machine. "The person you're waiting for," she said as they moved through the mechanical corridor, speaking quietly enough that her voice barely carried. "You called them, just now. 20 minutes ago, from the restroom." He glanced at her. "Does that bother you?" "I don't know yet." A pause. "Who are they?" "Her name is Sophia Bennett. We served together for 4 years. She was naval intelligence, signals, encryption, intelligence analysis. If there's something on that drive worth finding, she'll find it." Victoria was quiet for a moment. The orange clogs made small squeaking sounds on the concrete with each step. "You were military," she said. It wasn't a question. "Navy. What did you do?" "Complicated things." He left it there, and she let him, which he appreciated. The loading dock on Mercer Street was cold. October in this city had a particular kind of damp cold that got into your joints and stayed there. Mason opened the steel door and felt the air change, and 40 seconds later headlights swept across the alley and a dark sedan pulled up to the dock. Sophia Bennett was 36 years old and looked like someone you'd forget immediately if you passed her on the street, which had always been one of her greatest professional advantages. Medium height, dark jacket, hair pulled back. She had a messenger bag over one shoulder and a thermos in her hand, and the expression of someone who'd been woken from sleep and had decided to be civil about it. She looked at Mason. Then she looked at Victoria Hawthorne, bare-legged, wearing a gown that cost more than most people's cars, with bright orange rubber clogs on her feet. "Okay," Sophia said. "I need significantly more context than your text message provided." "Inside," Mason said. They found a maintenance office on the sublevel. A small room with a folding table, 2 metal chairs, a space heater that rattled when it ran, and a lock on the door that Mason tested twice before he was satisfied. Victoria set her clutch on the table and opened it and placed the flash drive, small, black, the kind you'd get free at a tech conference, on the table's surface. All 3 of them looked at it for a second. "Tell me what you know," Sophia said to Victoria. And Victoria Hawthorne, CEO of a billion-dollar company, sitting in a hotel maintenance room in borrowed kitchen clogs, took a breath and started talking. She talked for 11 minutes without stopping. Mason listened. He listened the way he'd been trained to listen, not just to what she was saying, but to how she was saying it, watching for the places where the story hesitated or tightened or came out in a rush. It was a way of reading people that he'd tried to leave behind with everything else from that part of his life, and it kept refusing to go. Her father, Edward Hawthorne, had built the company from a single logistics startup into a diversified empire over 30 years. He died of a sudden cardiac event 18 months ago. Victoria had taken over as CEO, not because she was the founder's daughter, but because she'd worked every division of the company since she was 22 and was, by most accounts, better at the job than anyone else available. Richard Calloway had been COO for 6 years. Her father had trusted him completely. 3 days ago, Victoria's IT director, a quiet, precise man named Gerald Foss, who'd been with the company for 12 years, had called her on her personal cell phone at 6 in the morning and told her he'd found something. Irregularities in the financial system, server access logs that didn't match authorized personnel. He'd been scared. She could hear it in his voice. He'd told her to access a specific directory on the company's secondary server using a password he gave her. He'd told her to copy everything she found to a physical drive and tell no one. She'd done it that night. Gerald Foss had not shown up to work the following morning. He hadn't answered calls or messages since. "The files on the drive," she said. "I couldn't decrypt most of them, but I saw enough unencrypted material to understand the shape of what was there. Financial transfers, dates, names I recognized, city officials, federal contractors, 6 years of it." She paused. "And there was one file I could open, an audio recording. I only listened to the first 30 seconds. "What was in it?" Sophia asked. Victoria's hands were flat on the table. She looked at them for a moment. "Richard Calloway," she said, telling someone that the cardiac event could be made to look entirely natural and that they needed to move before the quarter's financial audit. The maintenance room was very quiet. The space heater rattled. 3 weeks before my father died," Victoria said. "That recording is dated 3 weeks before my father died." Sophia picked up the flash drive and plugged it into her laptop without another word. Her fingers moved across the keyboard in the rapid, precise way of someone who thought faster than most people talked. Mason watched Victoria. She was staring at the wall, not at anything on it, just at the space in front of her. Her jaw was set. Her hands were still. He recognized that too. The particular stillness of someone who'd arrived at the far edge of something terrible and was choosing, moment by moment, not to fall off. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. "You're doing fine," he said. "I know that's not much." She held his gaze for a second. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but the small recognition of one person seeing another clearly. "It's something," she said. From across the table, Sophia looked up from her laptop screen. Her face said something that her voice hadn't yet. "Mason," she said, "this drive, whatever is on here, it's bigger than one company." A pause. "We need to talk about next steps very carefully." Outside in the hotel corridor, somewhere in the building above them, 2 men in stolen uniforms were still searching. Upstairs in the ballroom, 400 wealthy people were congratulating themselves. And in a maintenance room that smelled like industrial solvent and old carpet, 3 people leaned over a table and began the work of figuring out how to survive the night. Mason's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. "Mrs. Carver. Lily asked me to tell you good night. She's out like a light. Don't work too hard." He put the phone back in his pocket, looked at Sophia, looked at Victoria. "Don't work too hard." Right. Sophia worked the way she always had, quietly, methodically, with the kind of focus that made the rest of the world go away. Mason had seen her like this before, in a communications tent outside Kandahar, in a converted safe house in Djibouti, in the back of a moving vehicle with a laptop balanced on her knees and mortar fire within earshot. Sophia Bennett operated best when the stakes were highest, which had always struck him as either a gift or a curse depending on the day. The maintenance room felt smaller with all 3 of them in it. The space heater rattled its familiar rattle. Victoria had taken one of the metal chairs and sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, watching Sophia work with the focused patience of someone who'd learned that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Mason stood near the door. Old reflex. Position yourself where you can see who comes in and what direction to go if they have to run. He'd stood near doors in rooms all over the world. Some rooms were more dangerous than others. This one was somewhere in the middle, which wasn't as comforting as it should have been. "Talk to me," he said to Sophia. "Give me another 4 minutes." "We might not have 4 minutes." "Then let me work without talking to you, which will get you your answer faster." She didn't look up. "I'm trying to get through the encryption layer on the primary partition. Whoever built this drive knew what they were doing. Your IT man was serious about his work." "Gerald Foss," Victoria said quietly. "He built in a 2-key decryption. I have 1 key. It's embedded in the file structure, hidden in the metadata of a dummy folder. That's elegant, actually." A pause. I need the second key. Victoria looked up. I don't know any second key. Did Foss say anything else when he called you? Anything that seemed off topic or strange? Victoria stopped, thought about it. He said something odd at the end of the call. He said, "Remember the number of years your father spent building what he built?" I thought he was being philosophical. He was nervous. I assumed he was rambling. Sophia's typing slowed. How long did Edward Hawthorne run the company? 31 years. Sophia typed 2 characters. Something on her screen changed, and she was very still for a moment. That's it, she said. That's the second key. She exhaled through her nose. Not relief exactly, more like the quiet acknowledgement of a problem solved. He was careful. If anything happened to him before he could explain, he trusted that you'd know the answer. He trusted that you'd paid attention to your father. Victoria didn't say anything. The line of her jaw went tight for a moment, and then she smoothed it back out with the particular discipline of someone who'd been doing that all evening. Sophia started opening files. The first few minutes were quiet except for the sound of the keyboard and the space heater, and faintly somewhere above them, the muffled sound of the gala's live band playing something with a lot of brass. It struck Mason as absurd. 400 people eating canapes and dancing, while 3 people in the basement of the same building looked at evidence of murder. Life was full of that kind of absurdity. You stopped being surprised by it eventually. Then Sophia said, "Okay, I need you both to come look at this." They gathered around her laptop. The screen showed a spreadsheet, columns of numbers, account numbers, transaction codes, dates stretching back 6 years. To Mason, it looked like what it was, a financial document, which meant most of its meaning was opaque to him. But Sophia's finger moved along the screen and she started talking in the clipped, precise way she used when she was briefing, and the picture got clearer and uglier with each sentence. "These are wire transfers," she said. "Shell companies, 7 of them, that I can see immediately, probably more buried deeper. Money moving out of Hawthorne Consolidated subsidiary accounts in amounts small enough not to trigger automatic audits, into holding companies in 3 different countries. Then it gets cleaned and comes back as consulting fees, licensing agreements, service contracts." She scrolled down. 6 years. Whoever structured this was patient. They weren't stealing in a hurry. They were building something. "How much?" Victoria asked. "I'd need more time to total it accurately, but just from what I can see here," Sophia looked at the screen, "north of $200 million, possibly significantly more." The number sat in the room for a moment. "Open the surveillance folder," Victoria said. Her voice was even. It cost her something to keep it that way. Sophia opened it. Video files, dozens of them, each labeled with a date and a location code. She clicked the oldest one. Grainy footage, an office corridor, timestamp from 6 years ago. A man Mason didn't recognize handed a thick envelope to a man he did recognize from a photograph he'd seen in the hotel's event management files. Richard Calloway, COO of Hawthorne Consolidated. At the time, probably 43 or 44, dark suit, confident posture, the easy bearing of someone accustomed to being the second most important person in every room. Calloway put the envelope inside his jacket without looking inside it. Said something. The other man nodded. They went in opposite directions. "Gerald put cameras in places no one thought to look," Victoria said. She was watching the screen with an expression that Mason couldn't quite read. Not shock, something past shock, something harder. He must have been watching Richard for years, waiting until he had enough. "Why didn't he go to the authorities?" Mason asked. "Because the next folder is probably going to answer that question," Sophia said, and opened it. It did. Copies of financial records, different format, city budget documents, contractor payment records. Names. Mason recognized from the news. A deputy city comptroller, 2 federal contracting officers, a state senator's chief of staff. All of them receiving payments, routed through different mechanisms, different shell companies, but all traceable back to the same source. All of them connected to regulatory approvals, contract awards, and, on 3 separate occasions, decisions about federal investigations that had quietly gone nowhere. "He owns them," Mason said. "Calloway." "He's been buying them for years," Sophia said. "That's why Foss didn't go to the police. Who do you call when you don't know how far up the rot goes?" The answer was that you didn't call anyone. You built your evidence carefully, and you waited for the right moment. And sometimes the right moment found you before you were ready. Sophia opened the audio files folder. 12 recordings. She hovered over the one Victoria had described earlier, the one with the date 3 weeks before Edward Hawthorne's cardiac event, and looked at Victoria. "Your call," she said. Victoria nodded. Sophia clicked play. The recording quality was good. Gerald Foss had known how to plant a microphone, apparently. 2 voices, both male. The first one was Calloway. Mason had heard him on a brief video during the gala's opening remarks, a smooth, practiced baritone. The second voice was rougher, someone Mason didn't know. Calloway spoke first. "The quarterly audit is in 7 weeks. Once it starts, even my people in the comptroller's office can't keep a lid on the subsidiary accounts indefinitely. We need the transition to happen before then." The second voice. "The old man won't step down. We've tried." Calloway. "He's not being asked to step down." A pause. Long enough to be deliberate. The cardiac history is already in his medical file. His doctor has been cooperative. It needs to look like what it looks like, and it needs to happen in the next 3 weeks. After that, the daughter takes over as a figurehead while we complete the consolidation, and then we deal with her at the appropriate time. Second voice. "And if she's not the type to be a figurehead?" Calloway. "Then we deal with her sooner." Sophia stopped the recording. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Victoria's hands were in her lap, completely still. Mason looked at her, and she was staring at the laptop screen at the paused audio file with an expression that had gone very flat, the face of someone absorbing something enormous and not yet deciding what to do with it. He'd seen that face before. He'd worn it himself, in a hospital in Germany, when a doctor had explained to him the full extent of what a pressure plate IED had done to his knee and 2 of the men he'd been with. "He killed my father," Victoria said. Not a question. Not quite a statement. Something in between, trying the sentence out for the first time. "Yes," Mason said, because she didn't need softness right now. She needed someone to confirm the thing she already knew. She took a slow breath. Let it out. "All right," she said. And then again, quieter. "All right." Sophia looked at Mason over the laptop. Her expression said several things simultaneously. "This is larger than we thought. We are not equipped to handle this alone, and we need to move carefully because we do not know how many people in positions of authority are compromised." He read all of it in the 4 seconds she held his eyes before looking back at the screen. "I need to copy these files to a secondary backup," Sophia said, her voice back to its practical register. "The drive is the primary, but if something happens to it, I have 2 encrypted cloud backups I can push to from here," said Victoria. "My father had private servers, not company servers, completely separate. I have access. Calloway doesn't know they exist." "How confident are you in that?" "My father built them specifically because he'd started to suspect something was wrong. He told me about them 6 months before he died. He said," she stopped, started again. "He said that a man who built something real his whole life should have a place to keep what matters that nobody else can get to. I thought he was being sentimental." A pause. "He was being careful." "Use them," Mason said. Both backups. Right now." While Victoria handled that on her own phone, Mason moved to the door and stood with his ear close to the gap, listening to the corridor. The building's ambient sounds were familiar to him. The hum of the HVAC system, the distant mechanical clunk of the freight elevator, water moving through pipes somewhere in the walls. He'd cataloged all of it over 18 months. He knew what normal sounded like in this building, and nothing he heard right now was outside of normal. But the 2 men in event staff uniforms were still somewhere above them. And if Calloway had sent 2, he'd probably staged more. He thought about the layout of the hotel's sublevel. The freight elevator connected to the loading dock and to 2 upper floors. There was also a stairwell at the north end of the mechanical corridor. Staff access, coded door, but Mason had the code. And there was the laundry corridor, which connected to a utility passage that ran under the hotel's east wing and came up through a door that opened into the alley behind the adjacent parking structure. Options. He was always counting options. "Sophia," he said, without turning from the door, "if we needed to get the 3 of us out of this building without using any public entrance, what's the fastest route that keeps us off street cameras?" "I don't know this building." "I do. If we go out the Mercer Street loading dock, Your car is right there, but we'd be visible to the camera on the parking structure across the street. The alley route through the East Utility Passage puts us out on a side street with no direct camera coverage until the intersection, which is 40 yards from where you parked. Then the alley. My thought too. He turned back. How much longer do you need? 5 minutes for the secondary backups, Victoria said. She was typing on her phone with focused efficiency. 3 for my copy, Sophia said. Mason checked his watch. It was 10:22 p.m. The gala was scheduled to run until midnight, which meant the building's event security wouldn't stand down for another 90 minutes. Calloway was up in that ballroom somewhere, smiling at the right people, making the right toasts, and quietly running out of patience. He thought about Calloway standing at a podium that evening, opening the gala with brief remarks about the Hawthorne Foundation's mission and legacy, his voice warm with borrowed conviction. Mason had been near the service entrance during those remarks, not really listening, tracking a catering issue. He'd clocked Calloway the way he clocked everyone. A read, filed away, forgotten. Now he ran the memory back through a different filter. The way Calloway's eyes had moved to Victoria when he mentioned her father's name. Not grief. Not even a good imitation of grief. Assessment. Mason's jaw tightened. He let it go. I need to ask you something, Victoria said. She was still looking at her phone, still typing. You read my note, and you came. You could have called hotel security, handed it off, stayed out of it entirely. Why didn't you? The question landed in a quiet space between them. Mason considered it for a moment. I thought about it, he said honestly. And? You said you couldn't trust anyone else. He shrugged, a small movement, not dismissive. I've been in rooms where that was true. Not a lot of people believe you when you say it. Seemed like the least I could do was take you seriously. She looked up from her phone, held his gaze for a moment. What did you do? She asked. In the Navy, specifically. Nothing I can explain in a maintenance room in 5 minutes. Broadly, then. I went into difficult places and solved problems that weren't supposed to be solvable through normal channels. He paused. Then I stopped, because I had a daughter who needed a father who was actually present, not just alive. Something in her expression shifted. Not pity. He was grateful for that. More like the recognition of a person rearranging their understanding of someone else. What's her name? Lily. He said it the way he always said it. Plain, undecorated, the most important word he knew. She's 8. Before Victoria could respond, Sophia said, done, and closed her laptop. Primary drive, 2 cloud backups, and I've pushed an encrypted copy to a blind server I maintain personally. 4 redundancies total. Whatever happens to the physical drive, the evidence survives. Good, Mason said. We're moving in 3 minutes. I want everyone to understand the route before we go. He walked them through it quickly and clearly. The north stairwell, the utility passage, the east alley exit, Sophia's car. Simple, linear, no decision points once they started moving. The best plans were always simple. The complicated ones fell apart when the first thing went wrong, and something always went wrong. When we get out, Victoria said, where do we go? I can't go to my apartment. If Calloway has people watching the building, and I have to assume he does, I have a place, Sophia said. Off book. I keep a studio on the east side under a different name. Old habit. It's not comfortable, but it's clean and nobody knows about it. I have to make one call first, Victoria said. There's a federal attorney, Marcus Webb, DOJ, White Collar Crime Division. He's been quietly investigating Calloway's network for 2 years. He couldn't get traction because the evidence kept disappearing. I've met him twice. I think he's clean. You think, Sophia said. I've checked him as thoroughly as I can check anyone. His financial records are clean. He has no connection to any of the shell companies on that drive. And he's been trying to build this case without Calloway's people finding out, which tells me he knows the system is compromised and he's been careful. She met Sophia's eyes. I'm not operating on certainty. I'm operating on the best available information. That's all any of us have right now. Sophia looked at Mason. He thought about it for 3 seconds. Make the call, he said. Short. Don't say where we are or where we're going. Victoria nodded and stepped a few feet away, phone to her ear. Mason used the moment to check the corridor again, so still clear, still normal. Behind him he could hear Victoria's voice, low and steady, the brief clipped exchange of someone giving critical information in the fewest possible words. He heard her say, the evidence is real and it's secured. I can bring it to you, but I need 24 hours, and I need to know you can hold what I give you without it going through normal channels. Yes, I know what I'm saying. A pause. Because normal channels are compromised, Mr. Webb. That's the entire problem. Another pause, longer. Thank you. I'll be in touch. She ended the call and came back to them. He'll hold. He's meeting with us tomorrow night, location to be confirmed. She stopped. He sounded like someone who's been waiting a long time to hear what I just told him. All right, Mason said. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and checked the corridor one more time. Then let's get through the next 20 minutes first. They moved out in single file, Mason leading, Victoria in the middle, Sophia at the rear with her messenger bag and laptop. The mechanical corridor was exactly as Mason had left it, empty, fluorescent, humming with the indifferent sounds of a building that didn't know or care what was happening inside it. 40 feet to the north stairwell. Mason counted his steps automatically, the way he'd been trained to count things. Exits, distances, seconds. Some habits weren't just hard to kill. They were impossible. He had the stairwell door code entered and the door half open when he heard something above them. Footsteps on the stairs, descending fast, 2 sets at least, and the crackle of a radio turned low. He pulled the door shut and turned, and in one movement had both women moving back the way they'd come, away from the stairwell, no words needed, just direction and momentum. They were 15 feet back down the corridor when the stairwell door opened behind them. Mason didn't look back. He was already counting the distance to the utility passage, counting the seconds it would take to get there, counting the options. Ahead of him, the utility passage door was 60 feet away and on the left. Behind him, he could hear the 2 men in the stairwell stepping into the corridor, and then one of them said something sharp and low that meant they'd been spotted. Mason said, "Run," and they ran. Victoria moved faster than he'd expected, bare instinct overriding the awkward orange clogs, leaning forward, arms working, the raw physics of a person who has decided that slowing down is not survivable. Sophia was right behind her. Mason was last, and he was already running the next 30 seconds in his head. The utility door, the passage, the alley exit, the car, and also the 30 seconds after that, and the 30 seconds after that, because that was what you did. You ran the scenarios ahead, and you stayed in the one that kept everyone breathing. The utility passage door hit the wall when he shoved it open. They went through single file into a narrower, darker corridor that smelled like concrete dust and standing water, and Mason pulled the door shut behind them and hit the manual lock. Not much. It would hold maybe 45 seconds against someone determined. 45 seconds was enough if you used it right. "Move," he said. "End of the passage, door on the left, push it open and go right into the alley. Sophia's car is on the street at the end of the block. Don't stop." "Mason," Sophia started, "I'm right behind you. Go." They went. The passage was 60 feet long and poorly lit, and the floor was uneven in places, the kind of surface that wanted to catch your feet and take you down. Victoria hit an uneven seam and stumbled, caught herself against the wall, kept moving. Behind them, Mason heard fists against the utility door and then the sharper sound of something harder. Shoulder or boot. He counted. They hit the door at the end. The alley was cold and dark and real, the city's October air a shock after the mechanical warmth of the sublevel. Victoria and Sophia went right. Mason followed and pulled the door shut. The alley was empty. One dim street light at the far end. The sound of the gala. If you listened very carefully, the brass section still doing whatever it was doing was completely inaudible out here. The city had its own noise. Traffic on the avenue, a cab somewhere, the ambient hum of a million people living their lives at the same time. They walked fast, not running. Running attracted attention that walking didn't. Mason kept them close to the building line, away from the single streetlight. Sophia's car was a gray Honda that looked like every other gray Honda in the city, which was the point. She had the key out before they reached the corner. They were in the car and moving inside 90 seconds of hitting the alley door. Nobody spoke for 3 blocks. Then Sophia said, "You know they saw our faces." "Yes," Mason said. "Which means Calloway knows you're involved." "Yes." "Which means your hotel job is probably over." From the back seat, where Victoria sat with the flash drive held in both hands in her lap, she said, "I will make that right, whatever it costs." "That's not the priority right now," Mason said. I know, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. He looked out the window. The city moved past, indifferent and enormous. One thing at a time. Sophia drove. The gray Honda moved east through the city's nighttime traffic, unremarkable among 1,000 other cars, carrying 3 people and a small black flash drive that had already changed everything and hadn't even finished changing it yet. Mason's phone buzzed. He looked at it, expecting anything. It was a text from Mrs. Carver. "Good morning, early bird. Lily woke up and wanted water. She asked if you were home yet. I told her you were working late. She said to tell you she saved you a piece of her Halloween candy. The yellow one with the chewy center. She said you'd know which one." He stared at the message for a long moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and looked out at the passing city and thought about a yellow candy with a chewy center and about what it meant that a child thought to save something small for someone they trusted to come home. He would come home. That wasn't the question. The question was what the next 24 hours were going to cost and whether any of them were ready to pay it. Sophia's studio apartment on the east side was exactly what she'd promised. Not comfortable, but clean. A single room with a fold-out couch, a kitchen counter that doubled as a desk, blackout curtains on the one window, and a door with 3 separate locks that she engaged in sequence the moment they were inside. The walls were bare. There was no art, no photographs, nothing that accumulated memory or suggested that anyone actually lived here. It was the kind of space a person maintained the way they maintained a spare tire, not because they wanted to use it, but because the day you needed it and didn't have it was the day everything went wrong. Victoria sat on the edge of the fold-out couch and finally took off the orange rubber clogs. She set them on the floor and looked at them for a moment with an expression that was almost funny in a situation that wasn't funny at all. "I left a $1,200 pair of shoes in the Alderton Grand's ballroom," she said. "I'll write you a receipt," Mason said. She looked up at him. Something in her face loosened slightly. Not a smile exactly, but the almost shape of one. The kind that happens when a person is too tired and too frightened to fully commit to humor, but appreciates the attempt. Sophia dropped her messenger bag on the counter and opened her laptop again. She'd been quiet in the car for the last 10 minutes of the drive, which with Sophia meant she was running something through her head and hadn't finished yet. "Talk," Mason said to her. "I'm thinking." "Think out loud." She pulled out a chair and sat down and laced her fingers together on the counter. "The problem isn't the evidence. The evidence is solid. Foss built something that'll hold up in front of a federal judge. The problem is delivery. If we just hand it to Webb, Calloway's people will know within hours. He has someone inside DOJ. I'd put money on it, based on what I saw in those files. 2 investigations that went nowhere, both DOJ adjacent. That's not bad luck, that's a plug." "Webb's clean," Victoria said. "I believe you, but clean doesn't mean isolated. Webb reports to people. Those people report to people. One of those people is probably on Calloway's payroll." Sophia opened her laptop. "We need to get this evidence to Webb in a way that makes it impossible for Calloway to intercept or suppress it before it reaches a courtroom, which means we need it to go public at the same time it goes legal, simultaneously, not sequential." Mason sat down on the floor against the wall, not because there was nowhere else to sit, but because he thought better when he was low and grounded, always had. He looked at the ceiling, which was water-stained in one corner and otherwise unremarkable. "If Calloway moves first," he said, "what's his play?" "He announces himself as acting CEO," Victoria said. "There's a mechanism for it, the board's emergency succession clause. My father put it in place years ago in case of incapacitation. It requires a 2/3 board vote, but Richard has been managing the board for 6 years. He has the votes." She paused. "There's a shareholder meeting scheduled for Thursday, 4 days from now. It was supposed to be a quarterly review. If he calls an emergency session before then and invokes the succession clause, he can move into the CEO seat with the board's blessing before anyone outside the company knows what's happened." "How close is he to doing that?" "After tonight, I disappeared from his gala. His people didn't catch me. He knows I have the drive." She thought about it. "He'll move fast. Tomorrow maybe. Day after at the latest." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city made its nighttime sounds. Traffic, a distant siren, the irregular rhythm of an urban area that never fully went to sleep. Mason was still looking at the ceiling. He was running a very specific kind of calculation. The kind that had a different name in civilian life than it did in the Navy, but which was essentially the same process. You took your assets, your liabilities, your terrain, your timeline, and the other side's probable moves, and you found the window where your strengths lined up against their weakness. You didn't wait for perfect conditions. Perfect conditions never came. You found the best available window, and you moved. Calloway thinks we're going to run, he said. Both women looked at him. He spent 6 years running a conspiracy that worked because he controlled the information. He decided when things moved, what people knew, what they didn't. When you disappeared tonight, Victoria, his first assumption wasn't that you were coming back at him. His assumption was that you were trying to get out, get safe, get to a lawyer, maybe leave the country. Mason looked at Sophia. He's going to move against the company because he thinks that's where his vulnerability is. He's not thinking about where his physical vulnerability is. You want to use that, Sophia said. I want to use that. How? He told them. He talked for 7 minutes. The plan that came out of him wasn't elegant. It had rough edges and places where it depended on timing that couldn't be guaranteed, and one section in the middle that he was honest about, telling them flatly that it required him to be somewhere that carried real physical risk, and that they should factor that in when they decided whether to agree to it. He laid it out clearly and waited. Sophia chewed on her thumbnail, a habit she'd had since Kandahar that he'd never once mentioned. She looked at the counter and worked through the variables in her head the way she always did, visibly and methodically, like a person doing long division by hand. Victoria listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a few seconds. The emergency broadcast system, she said. I haven't thought about it in years. My father installed it when he built the headquarters. He was old-fashioned about certain things. He believed a CEO should always be able to speak directly to shareholders and employees without going through any intermediary. It's wired into every screen in the building, audio and video, live. Does Calloway know about it? I don't know. He knows the building well, but my father never publicized the system. It was in the original construction specs, which Richard would have had access to, but she stopped. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Assume he knows, Mason said. Plan as if he knows, and we'll be fine if he doesn't. If he knows, he'll have the broadcast room locked down. Which is why you'll need Sophia. Sophia stopped chewing her thumbnail. The broadcast room. What's the access situation? Biometric and code, Victoria said. My handprint and a 10-digit code. The code changes every 90 days. I'm the only one who knows the current sequence. And the system itself, hardware or software controlled. Hardware mostly. My father specifically didn't want it networked. He wanted something that couldn't be hacked or remotely disabled. Sophia nodded slowly. That's actually better. Software I can interfere with remotely, but so can his people. Hardware means whoever's in the room controls it, period. She looked at Mason. What's the false information we're leaking? Flight reservation, he said, under a name that's close enough to Victoria's that it'll raise flags when Calloway's people run the airport manifests. And they will. That's the first thing they'll check when they're trying to figure out where she went. Departure tomorrow morning, private terminal, destination Zurich. Traveling with personal documentation and an encrypted data package listed as cargo. He'll send people to the airport. I'm counting on it, but I'm not going to the airport. Mason looked at both of them steadily. I'm going to Whitmore. The name landed differently for each of them. Victoria didn't recognize it, and her face said so. Sophia did, and her face said something more complicated. Whitmore Naval Training Facility was 40 minutes outside the city, a decommissioned complex that had been mothballed 8 years ago when the Navy consolidated its regional training operations. It covered 42 acres, most of it open terrain with 3 large structures, a main administrative building, a tactical training building that had been stripped of most of its interior equipment, and a vehicle maintenance bay. It had been sitting empty for the better part of a decade, maintained on a minimal contract by a private facilities company, fenced but not seriously secured. Mason knew it for specific reasons. He'd trained there. He knew every building, every sightline, every approach and exit. He knew where the terrain favored a defender and where it didn't, where the natural light fell at different times of day, which structures would channel movement and which would disperse it. You're going to draw them there, Victoria said, understanding. I'm going to make Calloway's people believe I'm trying to get the drive out of the city using a private airfield northwest of Whitmore that a Navy veteran would know about. That'll redirect the ones he doesn't send to the airport. Give me a second team heading somewhere I know, and they don't. He paused. It buys you the window. How long of a window? Sophia asked. As long as I can make it. That's not an answer. It's the honest answer. I don't know exactly how many people he'll send or how long they'll take to figure out the misdirect. I'm hoping for 2 hours. I'm planning for 90 minutes. I'm prepared for 1. Sophia looked at him the way she'd looked at him before certain operations. Not quite fear, because Sophia didn't do fear in the conventional way, but the careful expression of someone taking a clear-eyed inventory of what might go wrong. You're going there alone, she said. Yes. Mason, I need you with Victoria. You're the only other person who knows that building systems well enough to help her get to the broadcast room if something goes wrong. And if something goes wrong with the broadcast, the whole thing falls apart. He said it without drama, just as a fact. I'll be fine. You don't know that. I know Whitmore better than anyone they're going to send. That counts for something. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she exhaled through her nose and turned back to her laptop because there was nothing left to argue, and she knew it. Victoria was watching Mason with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. Not admiration exactly. Something more complicated. Something that seemed to be working through several feelings simultaneously and not resolving neatly into any of them. You have a daughter, she said. I know. And you're still... I know. He met her eyes. But if we run, this follows us. It follows you forever. And people like Calloway don't stop. They just expand. He'll own more officials, cover more evidence, and the next person who figures out what he's doing won't have a flash drive already in their hands. They'll just disappear. He said it matter-of-factly. So yeah, I have a daughter, and I'm still. Victoria held his gaze for another moment. Then she nodded. Small, deliberate. The nod of a person who understands the weight of what's being offered and is choosing to accept it without pretending it costs nothing. They worked through the rest of the plan until 2 in the morning. Details, contingencies, timing, communications protocols. Sophia drafted the false flight reservation using a travel service account she maintained for exactly this kind of need, layering it into systems that Calloway's people would find when they looked. And they would look, because scared, powerful men always looked. That was how they stayed powerful. She planted secondary breadcrumbs. A storage locker rental near the private airfield, registered to a shell name with enough distance from Mason that it would take time to connect, but with enough trail that someone following carefully would eventually get there. The point was not to make it invisible. The point was to make it believable. Mason spent an hour with a city map in Sophia's laptop, walking through Whitmore's terrain from memory and cross-referencing with satellite imagery that was 4 years old but good enough. He identified 3 positions he could use, 2 fallback routes, 1 exit that was genuinely his own, and that nobody who didn't know the facility intimately would find before he was already gone. He thought about the knee, the reconstructed one. Cold weather made it stiffer than usual, and October at Whitmore with its open terrain and whatever the overnight temperature was going to do would not be kind to it. He factored that in. You worked with what you had. Around 2:30, Victoria fell asleep sitting up on the fold-out couch, which told him she'd been running on nothing but adrenaline for hours, and the body had finally called in the debt. He found a blanket in the closet. Sophia kept the studio stocked with the basics, never knowing when she'd need to be here, and draped it over Victoria's shoulders without waking her. She didn't stir. She looked younger asleep, less composed, more like a person, and less like a CEO, which made him feel the weight of what she'd carried tonight, and the night before, and the 18 months before that. He sat with Sophia at the counter, and they drank bad coffee from a French press that she kept in the cabinet and talked quietly. You're worried about the knee, she said. Little bit. You haven't done anything like Whitmore in 3 years. I know. You've been standing at a desk and managing hotel catering schedules. I know, Sophia. She stopped, looked at her cup. I'm just saying that the Mason who knows Whitmore is 3 years ago. The terrain is the same, but you're not. No, he agreed. I'm not. He drank his coffee. But I'm also not sending someone else to do it. She was quiet for a moment. Lily's going to want to know where you were. I'll tell her I worked late. At some point, that stops being enough of an answer. I know. He looked at his hands around the cup. I'll figure that out when she's old enough to ask better questions. He paused. She saved me a candy. Sophia looked at him. Yellow one. Chewy Center. He said it quietly. That's what I've got to come home to. That should be enough of a reason for me to be careful. Is it? He thought about it honestly. It's the best one I have. They let that sit there between them in the easy way of two people who'd been in bad places together and didn't need to fill every silence with words. At 4 a.m., Mason left the studio and drove Sophia's car to his apartment. Sophia would use a car service if needed, and they both agreed his apartment was a lower priority location for Calloway's people than Victoria's, at least for the next few hours. He went up, showered, changed into clothes that were built for movement, dark cargo pants, thermal layer under a fleece, boots that he hadn't worn in about a year and a half, and that required a minute to lace properly because of the knee. He ate a bowl of cereal standing over the sink. He checked his phone. Nothing from the hotel. His manager credentials were still active, which meant Calloway hadn't yet thought to make calls to civilian locations, or hadn't gotten to it yet. He stood in the doorway of Lily's room for a moment. She was asleep on her side, the stuffed rabbit under one arm, her hair across her face the way it always was. On her nightstand, next to her cup of water, was a yellow candy and a twist of orange cellophane. He stood there for about 30 seconds. Then he pulled her door mostly closed and left. The drive to Whitmore took 38 minutes at that hour. No traffic, no delays, the highway giving way to state roads, and then to the two-lane county road that ran along the facility's western perimeter. Mason had driven this road in the daytime a few times, just to keep the geography fresh in his head, the same instinct that made him note exits in restaurants and corridors in hotels. He told himself it was just a habit. He hadn't expected to be grateful for it on a cold October night driving towards something that was a very bad idea by almost any reasonable assessment. He pulled off the county road onto a gravel track that ran alongside the facility's north fence line, killed the headlights, and sat for a few minutes letting his eyes adjust. The facility was dark, no operating lights since the decommission, though the perimeter had low-wattage security lamps every 100 yards or so that ran off a solar array. They gave enough light to navigate by if you knew what you were looking at. He knew what he was looking at. He'd sent the second set of breadcrumbs, the ones pointing to Whitmore and the private airfield, through Sophia's system at 3 a.m. with a time delay that would surface them in the right places around 6 in the morning, when Calloway's people were already running the airport angles and would be looking for secondary leads. Figure they'd find it by 7:30. Figure another 40 minutes to get people moving, and then the drive out here. He had until roughly 8:15 before anyone arrived, if his timeline was right. He used the time. The north fence had a section where the chain link had pulled free from a support post. He'd found it on his last drive-by 3 weeks ago, when he hadn't known why he was checking and now understood he'd been keeping options open the way you did when you'd spent years in a business, where options were the difference between coming home and not. He went through, moved along the inside of the fence line toward the tactical training building, and went in through a ground floor window with a broken latch. Inside, the building was exactly as he remembered it. Stripped bare by the decommission, concrete floors and bare walls, the ghost of its former purpose visible in the mounting brackets and anchor points where equipment had once been bolted down. 3 floors. Multiple rooms on each floor. Stairwells at each end. A central atrium space on the ground floor that was the largest open area in the building. He spent 45 minutes placing himself, identifying the 3 positions he'd planned from Sophia's laptop and physically confirming they worked the way his memory said they would. They did, mostly. The second floor position had a sightline he'd underestimated, better than expected, which was a rare gift. The ground floor fallback was tighter than he'd liked, a corridor that funneled movement in a way that was both useful and limiting. He noted it and adjusted. His knee ached in the cold. He moved on it carefully, not favoring it too obviously. Favoring a bad joint too much transferred the strain somewhere else. And then you had 2 problems. He found a position on the second floor of the tactical building that gave him views of both entry points and the route between the main building and the vehicle bay, and he settled in to wait. He thought about the plan's other half, what was happening in the city while he was out here in the dark and the cold. Victoria and Sophia would be moving at 7 a.m., which was when the shareholder meeting's early registration opened, which was when the first legitimate attendees would be entering the building. The plan was for Victoria to enter through a loading bay entrance using her biometric credentials, which Calloway had presumably tried to revoke overnight, but facility biometric systems at Hawthorne Consolidated Headquarters ran on a 72-hour update cycle, another of her father's old-fashioned security preferences. He'd wanted a window in which legitimate access couldn't be yanked too quickly. He'd built in a margin. She was inside that margin. Barely, but inside it. 7 a.m. at the building. Sophia running interference on the technical side. Victoria getting to the broadcast room. 90 minutes to get the system running, test it, and be ready. The meeting started at 9:30. He checked his watch. 5:42 a.m. The cold settled into the building the way cold settled into empty buildings. Not dramatically, just gradually, the way water fills a low space. He pulled his fleece tighter and watched the pale gray that was starting to happen at the edges of the sky beyond the facility's eastern fence. His phone buzzed. "Sophia, we're moving at 7. Victoria's good. You?" He typed back. "In position, stay on schedule." Her response? "Watch the knee." He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. The first car arrived at 8:04, 11 minutes earlier than his estimate, which meant either Calloway's people were faster than expected or the breadcrumbs had surfaced ahead of the time delay. Either way, they were here, which was the point. One car, 2 men, which told him this was a scout team sent to confirm before the main element arrived. He watched them from his second-floor position as they parked outside the north fence and talked to each other for a few minutes, probably communicating with whoever was directing them remotely. Then a second car. Then, 10 minutes after that, a white panel van. He counted. 4 men out of the van, 2 from each car. 8 total, which was more than he'd planned for, and required him to adjust 2 of his positions and abandon 1 fallback entirely. He did the math fast and cold, the way he'd been taught, feeling something settle into him that wasn't exactly comfort and wasn't exactly its opposite. It was the particular clarity that arrived when the uncertain part was over, and the only thing left was the work. He pulled back from the window, moved to the stairwell, started down toward the ground floor, favoring the left side of each step to spare the knee, moving quietly in the half-dark of an abandoned building while 8 men somewhere below began working out how to come inside. He thought about Lily, the yellow candy on her nightstand. Then he put the thought away somewhere safe and focused. The trap was set. The question now was whether he could hold it long enough for Victoria to do what needed to be done. He moved to his first position and waited for the door to open. The first man through the tactical building's ground floor door made the mistake of moving fast without clearing his corners. Mason let him pass, then stepped out from the alcove behind the stairwell, a space barely wide enough to stand in, which he'd identified the night before as the one spot in the ground floor corridor that a person moving confidently toward the interior would not check. He had 3 seconds before the man's partner came through the door behind him. He used 2 of them. The first man went down hard and quiet, a controlled takedown that Mason's body remembered even if his knee didn't appreciate the mechanics of it. He was back in the alcove before the door opened again, the first man's radio in his hand, the man himself zip-tied with the plastic ties he'd brought specifically for this purpose and dragged into the darkness under the stairwell with enough efficiency that the second man through the door saw only an empty corridor. The second man was more careful. He swept the space with a flashlight, moved toward the interior with his back to the wall. Mason tracked him through a gap in the stairwell railing from the second step up, measuring the distance and the timing and the variables, and waited until the man's flashlight swept away from his position before he moved. 2 down, 6 remaining, somewhere in the building or approaching it from outside. His radio, the one he'd taken, crackled, and a voice said, "Vega, Domino, confirm interior sweep." No answer, because Vega and Domino were currently zip-tied in the dark. Another 10 seconds before the silence would register as a problem. He was already moving up the stairwell before the radio crackled again. The thing about Whitmore was that it had been designed for training, which meant it had been designed to teach people how to move through a contested building under stress. Mason had spent weeks inside these walls when it was operational, learning, and later teaching. He knew how the acoustics worked, how sound traveled between floors and where it deadened. He knew that the third-floor east stairwell had a landing with a 90-degree angle that broke sightlines in a specific useful way. He knew that the second-floor mechanical room had 2 access points, and that someone who knew about both of them and their opponent knew about neither had an advantage that was worth more than numbers. He used all of it. Not cleanly. The knee slowed him on the stairs more than he wanted to admit. And at one point, he misread the timing on a corridor crossing and had to pull back fast and wait 45 seconds in a utility closet while two men passed close enough that he could hear one of them breathing harder than the other. But he moved through the building the way water moves through familiar terrain, following the path his memory had already mapped. And the 8 men Calloway had sent looked for him in the places an ordinary person would go and found him in none of them. His phone vibrated against his thigh. He was behind a door on the second floor, listening to footsteps in the corridor outside, and he pressed the phone against his leg to muffle any possible sound before checking the screen. Sophia, we're in. Loading bay entrance worked, biometrics held. Moving to broadcast room now. He texted back one character, K. He checked his watch, 8:41. 49 minutes until the shareholder meeting began. Hold the line. That was the job now. Keep these 8 men occupied and confused inside this building for the next 49 minutes, or as close to that as he could manage. He'd been doing it for 37 minutes already. He was tired and his knee was specific about its unhappiness, and he'd taken an elbow to the ribs during the first takedown that was going to be a bruise by afternoon. But he was still moving, which was the only metric that mattered. He started working on the 3rd man. Victoria had not slept enough, and her feet hurt, and she was wearing clothes that Sophia had pulled from a duffel bag kept in the studio closet. Dark jeans, a black pullover, flat shoes that were half a size too small. None of that mattered. She was inside the building, which was the only thing that mattered right now. Hawthorne Consolidated's headquarters occupied a 22-story building in the city's financial district, and at 7:15 in the morning, its lobby was beginning to fill with the early arrivals for the shareholder meeting. Staff, security contractors, a few journalists who'd already staked out positions near the reception desk. Victoria moved through the loading bay corridor with Sophia behind her, keeping her face turned from the cameras she knew were positioned along the road. She knew this building the way Mason knew Whitmore. She'd walked every floor of it since she was a teenager, long before she ever ran anything. Her father had made sure of that. "You don't lead a place you don't understand," he'd told her once. "Walk the whole thing, every room, then walk it again." She'd thought at the time he was talking about management philosophy. She understood now that he might have been giving her something more specific than that. The broadcast room was on the 14th floor, in a section of the building that housed technical infrastructure. Server rooms, communications equipment, the building's primary AV control center. It was not on the standard office floor plan. It appeared in the original construction documents as a utility space. Richard Calloway had sat across from her in meetings on this floor dozens of times, and she was reasonably confident he'd never looked at the door directly to his left and thought about what was behind it. Reasonably confident, not certain. Nothing tonight was certain. Sophia had the construction documents on her laptop, cross-referenced with the current security system's layout, which she'd pulled remotely during the night using credentials that were legitimately Victoria's and therefore not triggering any alerts. Yet. The broadcast room's door was standard biometric, same system as the loading bay. Same 72-hour update window. Victoria put her hand on the reader. The light went green. She exhaled once. Then she pushed the door open and they went inside. The room was small, maybe 15 by 12 feet, and packed with hardware that looked dated by about 15 years, because it was. Her father had built it when the building was constructed and had maintained it on a separate maintenance contract that appeared in the company's books as a generic facilities expense, unspecific enough that nobody looking at a budget line would know what it covered. The equipment was old but functional. Her father had been meticulous about functional. Against the main wall was a broadcast console, monitor, camera mounted above it, audio panel, a master switch protected by a hinged cover. Below it, a label in her father's handwriting on a piece of tape that had yellowed with age. For when it matters. Victoria stood in front of it and felt something move through her that she didn't have the right word for. Not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. Something that was grief and fury and something else. Something that felt like finally. "Talk to me about the technical side," she said to Sophia, keeping her voice steady. Sophia set her laptop on the equipment shelf and pulled up the building's AV schematic. The system feeds directly to every screen in the building, lobby displays, conference room monitors, the main shareholder meeting room on the 3rd floor. It's hardwired, not networked, so it cannot be remotely interrupted once you activate the master switch. They'd have to physically cut power to the whole floor to stop it. She looked at the console. And before they figure out where the signal is coming from, we'll have a head start. How much of a head start? Depends how fast Callaway's building security responds. If he has people stationed on this floor, he shouldn't. I checked the security schedule last night through the admin portal. 14 through 17 are unoccupied this morning. All scheduled maintenance cleared out for the shareholder meeting logistics. Victoria paused. But if he found out we were coming and pulled extra people in, then we deal with it when it happens. Sophia pulled a drive from her bag, one of the backup copies of the flash drive's contents, already queued and organized into a presentation sequence she'd built during the night. Surveillance footage, financial records, transaction logs, at the center of it, unavoidable and damning, Gerald Foss's audio recordings. This is queued to run automatically once we connect it to the broadcast console. All you have to do is introduce it, tell them who you are, tell them what they're about to see, and flip the switch. How long is the presentation? 18 minutes. Long enough that even if they cut the feed partway through, the key evidence is front-loaded. The first 6 minutes are the financial records and the recordings. Anyone in that shareholder room will have everything they need in 6 minutes. Victoria nodded. She looked at her watch. 8:53, 37 minutes. Mason, she said. Sophia checked her phone. Last message was 8:41. He's still in the building. Victoria thought about Mason Brooks in an abandoned military facility with 8 armed men and a bad knee, buying time for a plan that she had asked him to be part of by pressing a crumpled note into his hand at a charity gala. The weight of that sat on her in a way she didn't try to set aside. She let it sit there because she thought it should, because a person who sent someone into danger and felt nothing about it was not the kind of person she intended to be. He'll be fine, Sophia said, in the tone of someone who was also working to believe it. You don't know that. No. A pause. But I know Mason, and I know what he does in buildings where other people are looking for him. She said it plainly, without decoration. I've seen it. He'll be fine. Victoria turned back to the console and began checking the connections. By Nuneaton, Mason had accounted for 6 of the 8 men. Not all of them the same way. The first 2 were still zip-tied under the stairwell, undiscovered. 2 more he'd redirected. He'd made enough controlled noise on the 3rd floor to pull them up while he went down, and then used the building's interior to keep them chasing echoes. 1 more had done him the favor of announcing his own position by using his radio at close range. The signal fed back through Mason's stolen unit and gave him a 30-second warning, which was 30 seconds he'd used well. The 6th had been the most difficult, a larger man, more careful than the others, who'd been methodically working the 2nd floor rather than responding to sounds, which meant he actually knew something about clearing a building. That one had taken longer and cost Mason a new bruise on his left forearm and the complete loss of any remaining benefit of the doubt about how the knee was feeling. 2 men unaccounted for. Probably outside, probably covering exits in case Mason tried to run, which meant the building was manageable now, and had been for the last several minutes, and what he was actually doing was waiting for the right moment to exit without walking into the 2 men outside. He was on the ground floor, back near the broken window he'd come in through, when his phone buzzed. Sophia. In position. Ready. 9:25 we go live. You need to be out of there. He looked at his watch. 9:17. He looked at the window. 8 feet. The 2 exterior men were, he thought through their likely positions based on what he'd seen from the 2nd floor before coming down. South exit and the main vehicle gate. The window opened to the north fence line, which was a blind spot from both of those positions if he moved along the building's exterior rather than across open ground. The knee was not going to enjoy this. He went out the window anyway. The morning air hit him cold and sharp, and he moved fast and low along the building's north wall, feeling the gravel and frost-stiff grass under his boots, counting his steps to the section of fence he'd come in through. Behind him, the building was quiet. The men still inside it working out where he'd gone. The 2 outside watching the wrong exits. He went through the fence gap and was back to Sophia's car in 90 seconds and was pulling out of the gravel track before anyone came around the building's north corner. His phone said 9:21. He dialed Sophia. I'm out, he said when she picked up. Any damage? Nothing that won't heal. He pulled onto the county road heading back toward the city. Are you ready? 4 minutes. A pause. Victoria wants to talk to you. A brief shuffle, then Victoria's voice. Are you okay? I'm driving, he said. Go do what you need to do. Mason, Victoria. He said her name with enough weight to stop her. You've been waiting for this your whole life, even if you didn't know it yet. Go do it. A silence. Then, okay. The line went quiet, and he drove. At 9:25 on a Thursday morning, in the third-floor shareholders' meeting room of Hawthorne Consolidated's headquarters, Richard Calloway was making the worst mistake of his professional life, and he didn't know it yet. The room held 212 people, board members, major shareholders, institutional investors, company executives, and 11 journalists who'd been given press credentials for what Calloway had announced, via an emergency board notice sent the night before, as a critical governance meeting. He stood at the front of the room in a dark suit that had been pressed that morning by a dry cleaning service that delivered to his penthouse, and he spoke with the measured confidence of a man who had spent 6 years building toward this moment. Edward Hawthorne built this company, Calloway said. His voice was warm, practiced, the voice of a man who understood that the performance of grief was sometimes more powerful than grief itself. He built it with vision, with sacrifice, with a commitment to the people who worked alongside him. And in the 18 months since his passing, we have all watched, with deep concern, as his daughter's leadership has raised serious questions about the company's stability and direction. Murmuring in the room. He let it settle. It is with genuine reluctance, and with the full support of the board, that I am invoking the emergency succession clause as outlined in the company charter. Every screen in the room went dark simultaneously. Calloway stopped. Around the room, people turned to look at monitors, at the large display behind the podium, at the smaller screens built into the conference table's surface, all of them dark. Then they came back on. Not to the presentation Calloway had prepared, to something else entirely. Victoria Hawthorne's face, live, looking directly into a camera. She was not in the room. She was somewhere else in the building, and her image was on every screen simultaneously. The shareholder room, the lobby displays, the monitors at every workstation on every occupied floor. And the audio was coming through the building's PA system at a volume that made it impossible to ignore. She did not look like someone who had slept in a borrowed studio apartment and spent the morning navigating a building where people were trying to stop her. She looked like her father's daughter, which was the most specific and accurate thing that could be said about her in that moment. My name is Victoria Hawthorne, she said. I am the CEO of this company and the daughter of the man who built it. I'm speaking to you today because the man standing at the front of your meeting room just told you my father built this company with sacrifice and vision, and that is the truest thing Richard Calloway has said in 6 years. A pause. Not for effect. A real pause. Someone organizing what came next because it mattered how it came. What he did not tell you is what I'm going to show you now. Calloway moved. He turned to the building's head of security, who was standing near the room's rear door, and said something sharp and low that the microphones didn't catch. The security chief's radio came up. He spoke into it. Calloway turned back to the room, and for just a moment, one fraction of 1 second, his composure cracked and something showed through that the people near the front of the room would remember later when they were asked about it. The screens didn't go dark, because the feed was hardwired, because her father had built a system that couldn't be turned off from anywhere except the room. Room it was broadcasting from, and the room it was broadcasting from had a locked door and Sophia Bennett on the other side of it. The financial records appeared first, column after column, account numbers, transaction codes, dates, and over them, Victoria's voice explaining in plain, clear language what they were looking at, naming the shell companies, naming the amounts, naming the officials who had received payments. Not legalese, not financial jargon, plain English, the kind her father had always insisted on in shareholder communications. Make them understand, he told her. Not impressed, not confused. Understand. She made them understand. When the first audio recording played, the room went very quiet. Calloway's voice and the voice of the man he'd spoken to 3 weeks before her father's death filled the shareholder room at 9:28 in the morning, and 212 people heard, in Richard Calloway's own words, the planning of a murder. Calloway did not run. That surprised some people later, though it probably shouldn't have. He was a man who had spent 6 years outmaneuvering obstacles, and his instinct was to stand his ground and calculate. He stood at the front of the room with his hands at his sides and his face doing the work of a man trying to stay composed while the floor fell out from under him. He was still standing there when the room's doors opened. Federal agent Marcus Webb was not a dramatic man by nature. He was 51 years old, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that had seen better days and carrying a warrant that had not. He had spent 2 years building toward this moment and losing pieces of it to forces he couldn't identify. And when Victoria Hawthorne had called him 3 nights ago and said, "I have what you need," he had believed her with the particular relief of a person who'd been waiting a very long time in the dark for a light to come on. He'd had the warrants ready by 6 a.m. He'd had his team staged outside the building since 8:30. He'd been watching the lobby feed on a tablet from a position across the street, and he'd seen the screens change, and he'd given the signal immediately. 3 agents entered through the main door, 2 more through the side entrance. Webb himself came through the center and walked directly toward Richard Calloway with the unhurried pace of a man who was very sure of where he was going. "Richard Calloway," Webb said, "you're under arrest." He said the rest of it, the legal language, the rights, the formal articulation of charges, in a clear, level voice while the screens around them continued to show 6 years of financial evidence that Calloway had spent 6 years making disappear. Calloway looked at Webb. Then he looked at the screens. Then, and this was the detail that a journalist near the back of the room would put in her story and that people would read and remember. He looked at the screen showing Victoria Hawthorne's face and said nothing, just looked. For 3 or 4 seconds, while an agent put handcuffs on his wrists, he looked at the screen. Then he looked away, and the composure was back. And he was Richard Calloway again. The Richard Calloway who had spent 6 years being whatever the moment required him to be, right up until there was no performance left that could help him. Webb's team moved through the room efficiently, separating the people they had warrants for from the people they didn't. The journalists, to their credit, stayed out of the way and kept their phones recording. 2 board members, a man named Pritchard and a woman named Solis, both of whose names appeared in Gerald Foss's financial records, were also placed under arrest, which caused a brief commotion near the left side of the room that an agent handled without drama. Outside the meeting room, in the building's lobby, the screens were still broadcasting. Victoria's presentation was 12 minutes in. A crowd had gathered at the lobby's glass walls. People from the surrounding buildings and the street stopped by the sight of the screens and then by what was on them. Some were recording on phones. By the time the presentation ended at 9:43, the footage was in the world in a way that had no recollection. On the 14th floor, in the broadcast room, Victoria watched the timer on Sophia's laptop count down to 0 and then pressed the master switch to off. The screens across the building went back to their normal displays. She sat back in the chair. The room was very quiet. The old hardware hummed its ambient hum. Sophia looked at her from across the equipment shelf. "It worked," she said, which was accurate but felt somehow insufficient. "Yes," Victoria said. "How do you feel?" She thought about that seriously for a moment, the way the question deserved. She felt a lot of things simultaneously, and none of them were clean or simple. She felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has been operating at maximum capacity for 36 hours. She felt something that was going to become grief later, when she had room for it. Grief for her father, for Gerald Foss, who had built this evidence in careful silence and paid a price she didn't fully know yet. For the 2 years of her own life she'd spent trusting a man who'd been building her destruction the whole time. She also felt something else, something harder to name. The feeling of a weight that has been in one place so long you forgot it was weight, finally shifting. "I feel like I need to know Mason is okay," she said. Sophia checked her phone. "He's on the highway. He'll be here in 25 minutes. Victoria nodded. She looked at the piece of tape on the console, her father's handwriting, yellowed and exact. "For when it matters." "Dad," she said quietly, to no one, to the room, to whatever remained in 31 years of her father's work in this building. "I hope that was enough." The equipment hummed. The city went on outside the building's windows, indifferent and alive. Sophia put her hand on Victoria's shoulder briefly. Not a hug, not a speech, just contact. The simple acknowledgement of one person to another that they had done something difficult, and it was done. Then she started packing up her laptop. They had to get downstairs. Webb's team was going to need both of them, and there were statements to give and evidence to hand over and a chain of custody to establish that would take the rest of the day. The legal process was its own long road, and it started now. But first, the 25 minutes. She would give herself that. Mason pulled into the building's underground parking at 9:56 a.m. He sat in the car for a minute after he turned off the engine. His knee was informing him in extensive detail of its objections to the morning's activities. His forearm had stiffened up. The bruise on his ribs was making itself known with every breath. Not sharply, but persistently, the kind of pain that didn't spike but also didn't let you forget it. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror. He looked like a person who had been in an abandoned building for 2 hours, doing things that his body was no longer as suited for as it used to be. Which was accurate. His phone showed 17 missed messages in the last 40 minutes, 6 from his hotel manager, 3 from numbers he didn't recognize, and 1 from the building's HR system that appeared to be some kind of administrative notice. The hotel already knew something had happened. Of course they did. The night's events were not the kind that stayed quiet. He looked at all 17 messages and put his phone in his pocket without answering any of them. There was one more message, separate from the others. Mrs. Carver sent at 7 a.m. Good morning. Lily had waffles for breakfast and told me to tell you she's saving the candy for when you get home. She says it doesn't count if you don't eat it in person. Rules are rules, apparently. Mason read that twice. Then he got out of the car. The lobby was controlled chaos when he came through the parking entrance. Federal agents, building security, journalists held behind a rope line near the main entrance. Clusters of Hawthorne Consolidated employees standing in anxious groups trying to understand what was happening to their company. He moved through it the way he moved through everything, quietly, toward the elevator bank. Victoria and Sophia were coming out of the elevator as he reached it. Victoria stopped when she saw him. She looked at the forearm, at the general state of him, at the way he was holding himself slightly to compensate for the knee, and her face did something complicated. "You're limping," she said. "A little. Are you—" "I'm fine." He said it the way he'd said it to Sophia in the studio the night before, not dismissively, just matter-of-factly, the way a person says a true thing. "It worked?" "It worked." She held his gaze for a moment. "All of it." "Good." He nodded once. The lobby was loud around them, and there was a federal agent moving in their direction who probably needed to talk to all 3 of them, and the day was just beginning in terms of what it was going to demand. He knew all of that. He was also very tired and his ribs hurt, and he was thinking about a yellow candy and a twist of orange cellophane sitting on a nightstand 40 minutes from where he was standing. "Then let's go give your statement." Sophia fell in beside him as they walked toward Webb's team, and she was quiet for a few steps before she said, "The knee. Still attached. That's a low bar." "It's the bar I had this morning." He glanced at her. "You can say you told me so." "I will," she said. "Later. At length." She paused. "I'm glad you're here." He was too. He didn't say it out loud, but he was. Victoria gave her statement first. In a temporary command post Webb's team had set up in a first-floor conference room. She was thorough and specific and unflinching, and she handed over the flash drive, the original, along with documentation of the 4 redundant copies. With the careful precision of someone who understood that this moment was where the evidence either held or didn't and was making sure it held. Webb listened to everything and said very little, and when she finished, he looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been carrying a heavy case file for 2 years and just felt someone else take some of the weight. "Ms. Hawthorne," he said, "I'm going to need you available for the next several weeks." "I'll be here," she said. "This is my company. I'm not going anywhere." By noon, Calloway and the 2 board members were in federal custody. By 1 p.m., the story was on every major news network, built around the footage that journalists in the shareholder room had recorded on their phones. By 3 p.m., the company's stock, which had dropped 12% in the morning's chaos, was recovering, because what the markets had seen, by the end of the broadcast, was not a company in collapse but a company with its roof blown off, the rot inside it finally visible, the structure underneath intact. At 4:15, a federal forensics team retrieved Gerald Foss from a hotel room on the east side of the city where he'd been in hiding for 3 days, surviving on room service and the particular terror of a man who knows what he knows and doesn't know if knowing it is going to save him or get him killed. He was dehydrated and had lost weight, and when he opened the hotel room door and saw that the person on the other side was a federal agent rather than anyone else, He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands for about 30 seconds. He would cooperate fully with the investigation. His testimony, combined with the evidence on the drive he'd built in careful silence over 2 years, would be the foundation of a federal case that prosecutors later described as one of the most thoroughly documented corporate fraud and homicide conspiracies they had ever seen. Victoria learned about Foss at 4:30 when Webb told her. She went to see him that evening. He was in a federal facility for his own protection, and the meeting lasted 40 minutes, and neither of them said much about what had been said in the room, but when she came out, her face said enough about what it had cost them both to get here. At 5 p.m., Mason left the building. He hadn't been asked to stay. His role in the day's events was something Webb's team was still working out how to categorize, which was fine by him. He'd given his account of the previous night, the maintenance room, the sub-level escape, Whitmore. He'd been direct and complete. Webb had looked at him with the particular expression of a federal agent looking at a former SEAL who has done several things outside the conventional legal framework and is deciding how to feel about it. And Mason had looked back without apology, because none of his decisions from the previous night were ones he regretted. Webb had ultimately said, "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Brooks," which was federal agent for "I have complicated feelings about this, but you helped break a major case, so we're going to call it even." Mason had said, "Yes, sir," and meant it, and left. He sat in the car in the parking garage for a few minutes. The knee was stiff from sitting during the hours of statement giving. He stretched it carefully, the way the physical therapist had shown him 3 years ago, feeling the familiar resistance and the familiar ache, and the way it gradually loosened if you were patient with it. His hotel manager had called 4 times. He texted back, "I'll come in tomorrow and explain. I'm sorry for the short notice." The response came back in 2 minutes. "Mason, it's all over the news. Take the rest of the week. We'll talk Monday." He stared at that for a moment. Then he put the car in reverse and started home. The city moved past the windows the way it always did, indifferent to everything that had happened, processing it as it processed everything else, absorbing it into its enormous ongoing noise. People on sidewalks, lunch crowds thinning into afternoon foot traffic, the particular slanted light of October in a northern city that made everything look slightly more dramatic than it was. He thought about the note in his pocket. He still had it. The folded piece of paper from Victoria Hawthorne's notebook, the 12 lines of careful handwriting that had started all of it. He'd transferred it from his hotel jacket to these clothes without really thinking about it, the way you carry something that doesn't feel like it should be left behind. He drove home. He parked in his spot. He went upstairs. Mrs. Carver was watching a cooking show when he opened the apartment door, and she looked at him over the back of the couch with the assessing expression of a 70-year-old woman who has seen enough to know when a person has had a night and a day that they're not going to talk about. "Lily's in her room," she said. "She didn't know if you were coming for dinner." "I'm here," he said. "Mrs." Carver gathered her bag and patted his arm on the way out. No questions, no commentary, and the door closed behind her. He stood in his own kitchen for a moment. The apartment was quiet with the particular quality of a space that a child inhabits, which was different from the quiet of spaces that didn't have children in them, full of small evidence. A drawing on the refrigerator, shoes by the door in the wrong place, a half-eaten sleeve of crackers on the counter. "Dad?" Lily appeared in the hallway in her socks, 8 years old, and still young enough that her face, when she saw him, arranged itself into pure, uncomplicated relief before she'd even decided what she felt. He crouched down, carefully, because of the knee, and she crossed the hallway in 4 steps and ran into him, and he held on. She smelled like the apple shampoo she'd been using since she was 5, and her hair was in the lopsided braid that Mrs. Carver attempted every morning with limited success. And she was solid and warm and completely real in a way that nothing else from the last 18 hours had been quite real enough. "You're home," she said into his shoulder. "I'm home," he said. She pulled back after a moment and looked at his face with the direct, unfiltered scrutiny that children apply to adults when they suspect something, and then she reached into the pocket of her hoodie and produced a yellow candy in a twist of orange cellophane. "I saved it," she said. "I told Mrs. Carver you have to eat it in person. You can't just take it home." "That's a rule?" "That's the rule." He took the candy from her, unwrapped it, ate it, which turned out to be lemon with a chewy caramel center. Inexplicably, both things at once, the kind of candy that makes no logical sense and tastes exactly right. Good? She asked. Yeah, he said. Really good. She looked satisfied, the way children look when a small, important thing has been handled correctly, and took his hand and pulled him toward the kitchen. Mrs. Carver left soup, she said. It has the noodles you like. He let her pull him. The apartment was warm. The October dark was coming down outside the windows. Everything that had happened since last night, the maintenance room, the drive through the city, the cold hours at Whitmore, the lobby, the federal agents, the evidence, the recording of a dead man's voice planning a murder. All of it was real, and none of it had gone away. And it would be present tomorrow and the day after in ways he'd have to deal with one piece at a time. But Lily's hand was small in his, and the soup had the noodles he liked, and the candy had been saved for him. For tonight, that was the whole world. The weeks after the arrest moved the way weeks move after something enormous has happened. Not smoothly, not cleanly, but in the lurching, exhausting rhythm of aftermath, where the crisis is over, but its weight keeps redistributing itself into new shapes every day. Mason went back to work on Monday, the way he'd told his manager he would. He put on the navy jacket and the gold name tag and walked the corridors of the Alderton Grand and managed the things that needed managing. A broken ice machine on the 4th floor, a staffing conflict between 2 catering supervisors, a guest complaint about noise from an event setup that ran late. Normal things. The kind of things that had constituted his entire professional life until 11 days ago, and which now required a conscious effort to engage with at the same level of seriousness they had before. His manager, a decent man named Howard Pruitt, who had worked in hotel operations for 30 years and had seen a fair amount of human behavior in that time, called Mason into his office on the first morning back and closed the door and did not say what Mason expected him to say. He said, I watched the news, all of it. He paused. I'm not going to ask you what happened or why you didn't tell me. I don't need to know. Another pause. But I need to know if you're okay to be here. Mason thought about it honestly, which was what Howard deserved. I think so, he said. I need the normal. The normal helps. Howard nodded, like that made sense to him, which it probably did, because a man who'd worked 30 years in hotels had dealt with enough human beings in enough states to understand that sometimes ordinary work was the thing that kept a person level. The broken ice machine is your first priority, Howard said. Guest on 4 has been calling since 6 a.m. I'll handle it, Mason said. He handled it. And the catering conflict, and the noise complaint, and the 14 other things that landed on his desk before noon, and by the time the afternoon shift started, he had achieved the specific, useful tiredness of a person who has filled their head with small practical problems and left less room for the large ones. The large ones were still there. They just waited their turn. The federal case moved with the grinding deliberateness of federal cases, which is to say, it moved slowly and with great paperwork. Mason had given his formal statement twice, once at the building on the day of the arrest, once at the DOJ field office 5 days later with an attorney present who had been arranged by Victoria and whom Mason had accepted reluctantly and been grateful for practically. The attorney, a compact woman named Reyes who spoke in precise economical sentences, had advised him clearly on what he needed to say and what he was not obligated to elaborate on, and the second interview had gone without incident. There was a question, for about 10 days, of whether Mason's activities at Whitmore were going to create legal complications. Webb had been direct with Reyes about it. The men at Whitmore were private security contractors operating under fraudulent employment documentation, and all 8 of them had since been identified and were cooperating with the investigation in exchange for considerations that were above Mason's pay grade to worry about. No charges were filed against Mason. The 2 men he'd restrained had required medical attention for minor injuries. Both were alive and functional and were, in the legal framing that emerged, people who had been in the process of committing crimes when they were stopped. Reyes had told him, from a legal standpoint, you're clear. She'd said it the way lawyers say things, carefully, specifically, with the implicit understanding that clear had a precise meaning that shouldn't be stretched. He'd said, good. She'd said, you understand you did several things that most people wouldn't do. I understand that, he said. I'm not judging it. I'm just noting it for context. Noted. She had almost smiled at that. Almost. Gerald Foss emerged from federal protective custody after 3 weeks, once the immediate risk to his safety had been assessed and managed. He was thinner than he'd been and had a quality about him that Mason recognized from his own experience, the particular flatness of someone whose internal alarm system has been running at maximum for so long that when it finally stops, they don't know what normal feels like anymore. Victoria met with him twice in the first week after his release. The second meeting she told Mason about later. Foss had apologized. He'd said he should have come to her sooner, that he'd been afraid, that he'd watched Calloway work for 6 years and had understood enough about who Calloway was connected to that he hadn't trusted any conventional channel to protect either of them. Victoria had told him that she understood. She'd meant it. A man who had watched his employer's father get murdered and then spent 2 years quietly building the evidence to prove it, alone, without knowing if any of it would ever matter. That was not a man who deserved anyone's judgment. That was a man who had done what he could with what he had in the situation he was in, which was the most any person could honestly be asked to do. She'd offered him his job back. He'd taken it, and then he'd spent his first week back systematically documenting every process he'd used to hide and transmit evidence, which he gave to federal investigators as supplementary material that closed several remaining gaps in the financial record chain. Foss was not a hero in any dramatic sense. I was a quiet, precise, frightened man who had done a courageous thing at great personal cost without any guarantee that it would work, and he was going to carry the weight of those 2 years for a long time. Victoria made sure he had the resources to carry it, professionally, financially, practically. It was not repayment. There was no repayment for that kind of thing. It was just what you did for someone who had protected what mattered at the cost of their own peace. The board reconstituted itself without Pritchard and Solis, who were facing their own charges alongside Calloway. The 4 remaining independent board members held an emergency session in the second week after the arrest and formally confirmed Victoria's position as CEO, a vote that was unanimous and that Victoria accepted without the ceremony that the moment might have warranted because she was already 20 meetings deep into the work of stabilizing a company that had spent 6 years being systematically hollowed out from the inside. The stabilization was not a simple thing. The shell companies Calloway had built had entangled themselves into legitimate Hawthorne consolidated operations in ways that took forensic accountants 6 weeks to fully map. 7 subsidiary accounts were frozen pending investigation, which created cash flow problems that Victoria addressed through a combination of short-term financing and a very direct communication to the company's major creditors that laid out exactly what had happened and exactly what she intended to do about it. The communication went out under her signature on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, 3 of the 5 major creditors had responded favorably. The other 2 took another week. It was not elegant and it was not comfortable, but it worked, and the company did not fall. The thousands of employees whose futures had been at the edge of the cliff because of 6 years of systematic theft kept their jobs, kept their benefits, kept the futures they'd built inside an institution that had been used as a vehicle for someone else's greed without their knowledge. That mattered to Victoria in a way that was hard to articulate, but that she felt specifically and personally every time she walked through the company's floors and saw people working. Her father had built this for them as much as for himself. The obligation ran in both directions. Sophia left the city 3 weeks after the arrest, the way Sophia always eventually left places, with minimal ceremony, maximum practicality, a brief conversation over coffee that covered the essentials and left the rest understood. She and Mason met at a diner near her East Side studio on a Sunday morning, and she had her messenger bag already packed and her jacket on, which told him she was leaving that day and had timed this coffee to be the last thing before she went. "Where?" he asked. "Seattle for now. There's work." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "The kind I do." He nodded. He knew what the kind she did meant, and also that he wasn't supposed to know specifically, and that both of those things had always been true about Sophia, and probably always would be. "The Whitmore thing," she said. "You know you don't have to pretend it was nothing." "I'm not pretending." "You're doing that thing where you fold it up and put it somewhere." "That's not the same as pretending." She looked at him levelly. "No," she conceded. "It's not." She drank her coffee. "You were good in there, even with the knee." "The knee was fine." "The knee was not fine." "The knee got me out of the building." "Mason." She said his name the way she said it when she was being direct about something that mattered. You still have it, whatever it is. The part of you that knows how to do what you did at Whitmore. A pause. I just want to make sure you know that's not a problem. Some people come home from what we did and spend years trying to cut that part out of themselves, like it's something wrong with them. It's not wrong. It's just a tool. The question is what you use it for. He sat with that for a moment. Outside the diner window, the Sunday morning city was doing its slow-paced weekend thing. People walking dogs, couples with coffee cups, a kid on a scooter navigating the sidewalk with enormous concentration. I used it to help someone, he said. Yes. She looked at him. So maybe stop apologizing to yourself for having it. He hadn't thought of it as apologizing, but sitting there with his coffee cooling in his hands, he recognized something in what she'd said that was more accurate than he wanted to immediately admit, and he filed it somewhere to think about later. They finished coffee. She picked up her bag. He walked her to the door and they stood on the sidewalk in the October turning November cold for a moment. Call me, he said, when I can. Which was the honest version of yes, because Sophia's life was structured in ways that made consistent communication a logistics problem rather than an intention problem. You're going to be okay, you know. I know. Not because of what happened, just in general. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him across a lot of different tables in a lot of different countries. You've got the kid and the hotel and your boring normal life. The word boring had something fond in it. Don't mess it up trying to be more than that. I won't. She nodded, turned, walked toward the corner and didn't look back because that was Sophia, and the not looking back was its own kind of affection if you knew how to read it. He watched her go. Then he turned up his collar against the cold and walked back to his car. Victoria called him on a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 4 days after the arrest. Not a text. An actual call, which felt deliberate, and he answered it on the second ring. I want to see you, she said without preamble. Not to talk about the case, not about the company. A pause. He could hear her choosing words with more care than usual, which for Victoria was saying something. I want to see you. I thought I should ask directly instead of making it complicated. Okay, he said. Okay, you'll see me, or okay, you understand what I'm saying. Both, he said. Dinner. You pick. A silence. Then, and there was something in it that he'd remember later. Can I come to you instead? I don't need a restaurant. I want to be somewhere that's actually yours. He thought about his apartment, the drawing on the refrigerator, the shoes by the door, the bowl of cereal he'd eaten standing over the sink that morning because he hadn't gotten around to the table. The ordinary, unmade reality of a life lived without anyone watching. Saturday, he said, 6 o'clock. I'll cook something. You cook? Badly, he said honestly. But Lily has opinions about food, so I've gotten better out of necessity. She laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that doesn't get managed before it arrives. And it sounded nothing like the composed CEO from the gala or the controlled, frightened woman from the maintenance room. It sounded like a person. Saturday, she said. 6 o'clock. He told Lily about it on Thursday, because she deserved warning, and because lying to her by omission was something he'd decided years ago he wasn't willing to do about things that mattered. She was 8, but 8 was not as young as people without children assumed it to be. They were at the kitchen table doing her math homework, which involved fractions, and which Lily found deeply suspicious as a concept. Why do fractions exist, she said, not as a question but as a philosophical objection. Because you can't always have the whole thing, he said. Sometimes you have to work with part of it. She considered this. That's annoying. Most true things are. She wrote something in her notebook. Then, who's coming Saturday? He looked up. How did you know someone was coming? You bought the good pasta. She said it matter-of-factly. You only buy the good pasta for company. He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the expression she'd inherited from no one he could identify, an expression of patient, slightly amused adult-level observation in a face that still had the rounded softness of a child. It struck him sometimes, these moments, the flashes of whoever she was becoming, visible through whoever she still was. Her name is Victoria, he said. She's someone I helped at work a few weeks ago. The gala lady? Lily said. Mrs. Carver watched the news. She said you were on it. You didn't look like you were on it. I wasn't on camera. Mrs. Carver said you helped someone important. I helped someone who needed help, he said. That's all. Lily thought about this. She drew a fraction in her notebook. 1/2, carefully written. Is she nice? I think so, yeah. Does she know about me? She knows you exist. She knows your name. She knows about the candy rule. Lily looked up sharply. You told her about the candy rule? It came up. This seemed to satisfy some condition he didn't fully understand. Lily looked back at her notebook. Okay, she said, with the tone of someone who has processed a piece of information and arrived at a provisional conclusion. I'll be normal. You don't have to be normal. Just be you. Dad, she looked at him. When I say I'll be normal, I mean I won't ask her weird questions right away. He almost smiled. I appreciate that. I'm going to ask some eventually. I know. She went back to her fractions. He went back to watching her do them, and the kitchen was warm and the overhead light made everything look slightly amber the way it did in the evenings. And he sat with the specific ordinary beauty of a Thursday night with his daughter and felt it the way he'd been trying to learn to feel things, present, without immediately categorizing it or filing it away. Saturday came with cold weather and a sky the color of old pewter. Mason made a chicken and vegetable pasta using a recipe he'd adjusted 3 times over 2 years to account for Lily's specific objections, which were too much garlic, not enough salt, and any vegetable that turned mushy in the sauce. He'd solved the first 2 through straightforward calibration. The mushiness problem had required research. He made the good pasta because Victoria was coming, and he'd already bought it, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. Lily had dressed herself in what she considered a reasonable dinner outfit, dark leggings and her second-best sweater, the purple one, and had redone her own braid twice, dissatisfied with the results both times, before announcing that it was fine and she was done. She'd set the table without being asked, which meant she'd put out 3 plates and 3 sets of silverware, and then arranged a small ceramic vase she'd made at school in the center of the table because she said it was decorative. Mason looked at the table and felt something move through him that he didn't try to name. He just let it. Victoria arrived at 6:03. She knocked instead of buzzing, which meant someone in the building had let her in, and when Mason opened the door, she was standing in the hallway in jeans and a dark coat, holding a bottle of wine in a small paper bag. And she looked, he noticed this specifically, like she'd made an effort that wasn't designed to look like an effort, which was different from the gala, and different from the maintenance room, and different from the broadcast room, and was, in its own way, more honest than any of those versions had been. I brought wine, she said, and these, she held up the paper bag. They're from the Italian bakery on Clement Street. The woman at the counter said they're for after dinner, but I'm going to be honest with you, I almost ate one in the cab. Come in, he said. She came in. He took her coat. She looked at the apartment the way a person looks at a space they've been trying to imagine and are now adjusting the image to match reality. Not disappointed, not performing appreciation, just genuinely taking it in. The drawing on the refrigerator, the shoes by the door, the bookshelf that was organized in a system that made sense to him and probably to no one else. Then Lily appeared from the hallway, and she looked at Victoria, and Victoria looked at her. Hi, Lily said. I'm Lily. I know, Victoria said. Your dad talks about you. A pause. The candy rule sounds very serious. Lily's expression shifted into something that was trying not to be a smile and losing. It is serious, she said. He didn't explain it right, probably. Tell me the right version, Victoria said. They went to the kitchen, and Lily told her the right version, which turned out to involve a longer history than Mason had been aware of, originating from a Halloween 2 years ago that he'd worked through and had only been able to make it home for the last hour. And the candy had been a way of making the holiday real across the gap of his absence. He hadn't known that's what it meant. He stood at the stove listening to his daughter explain it to a stranger and understood something about his own child that he hadn't fully understood before. Children keep the things that matter. They carry them in candy rules and ceramic vases and second-best sweaters. They keep the record of what they've needed and been given and been asked to wait for, and they translate it into small rituals that persist long after the original circumstances are gone. He stirred the pasta sauce and thought about that. Dinner was not smooth. The pasta was slightly oversalted because he'd been distracted and overcompensated for Lily's standing objection. The ceramic vase kept getting in the way of the serving dishes and had to be moved twice. Lily asked Victoria 4 questions in the first 15 minutes that she'd promised herself to save for later, including one about whether Victoria was scared when she was hiding in the hotel, which Mason started to redirect and which Victoria answered directly and honestly, and at a level that was exactly right for an 8-year-old. Not condescending and not graphic, just true. "Yes," Victoria said. "I was scared. I was very scared. But your dad was there, and I wasn't scared the same way after that." Lily absorbed this. "Because he used to be in the Navy?" "Because he paid attention," Victoria said. "That's different from being in the Navy. Some people are in the Navy and don't pay attention. Your dad paid attention to me when I needed someone to." Lily looked at her father with an expression that recalibrated something and then filed it away. "He pays attention to me too," she said, in a tone that wasn't boasting but was something more solid than that. Confirmation. The statement of a fact she knew well and was presenting as evidence. "I know," Victoria said quietly. "I can tell." After dinner, Lily lasted 30 more minutes before the day caught up with her and she started the progressive shutdown that children do. Slower responses, heavier eyes, a posture that was gradually losing its architecture. Mason sent her to brush her teeth and she went without the usual argument, which told him she was more tired than she was admitting. He went and sat on the edge of her bed the way he did every night, and she asked him 2 things in the way she did when she was almost asleep, and her filters were down and the real questions came through. The first was, "Is she going to come back?" He thought about it. "I hope so," he said. Because "I don't know" was true but incomplete, and "yes" was a promise he wasn't in a position to make. And "I hope so" was both honest and not nothing. Lily considered this with her eyes half closed. "Me too," she said. The second was not a question. She said, in the voice that was already blurring toward sleep, "Dad, you seem different." Different how? But she was already going under, and the answer didn't come. He sat with that for a moment. Then he turned off her light and went back out. Victoria was in the kitchen. She'd found the dish soap and was washing the pasta pot, which he hadn't expected, and which she did with the focused practicality of someone who'd decided this was a reasonable thing to do and saw no reason to announce it. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She kept washing. "I wanted to." He picked up a dish towel and dried the things she handed him, and they stood at the kitchen sink doing something so domestically ordinary that the contrast with 11 days ago was almost funny. And he thought about saying something about that and then didn't, because some contrasts spoke well enough for themselves. When the pot was done, she turned off the water and leaned against the counter and looked at him. "How are you actually doing?" she asked. "Not, I'm fine. Actually." He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "The knee is better," he said. "The hotel is normal. Lily is good." He paused. "I had a conversation with Sophia before she left. She told me to stop apologizing to myself for being the kind of person I am." "Are you?" "Working on it." He looked at the dish towel in his hands. "I spent 3 years being very deliberate about not being the person I was before. Because the person I was before was..." He stopped. Started again. "I was good at a very specific thing that requires you to be comfortable with the possibility that today might be the last day. And I didn't want to be that comfortable anymore. Because of Lily. And now? Now I think Sophia might be right. I think I was confusing stopping doing the thing with stopping being the kind of person who could do it. And those aren't the same." He folded the dish towel. "Being able to do it doesn't mean I have to. It just means I have a choice. And the night at the gala, I made a choice, and I'd make it again." Victoria was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window, the city's night sounds were their usual indifferent ambient chorus. "Richard Calloway's trial date is being set," she said. "Webb called me yesterday. He thinks we're looking at 8 to 12 months before it goes to court. Between now and then, there will be depositions and more statements, and things we'll both be asked to do that aren't comfortable." She paused. "I want you to know that I won't ask you for anything you don't want to give. Whatever you gave that night, that's already more than I had any right to ask for." "You didn't ask for most of it," he pointed out. "I asked you to show up." "That's the part that was easy," he said. And he meant it, which was the thing about that night that he'd spent 11 days turning over and always arrived at the same place with, The decision in the hotel bathroom had not been a hard one, and he didn't fully understand why not. And he'd eventually stopped trying to understand it and just accepted it as something true about himself that had been waiting for the right conditions to show up again. The rest of it was just problem solving. She smiled at that. Small, real, nothing performed about it. "You're very strange," she said. "I know. I mean that as a compliment. I know that too." She reached into the paper bag she'd brought and produced 2 pastries from the Italian bakery. Small, dusted with powdered sugar, the kind that left a mark on your shirt if you weren't careful. She handed him one. He bit into it. It was better than expected, the way things sometimes were. They stayed in the kitchen for another hour, talking the way 2 people talk when they've been through something together and are now trying to find out who they are to each other on the other side of it. It was not romantic in the sweeping sense. It was quieter than that and more complicated and more real. 2 imperfect people in a kitchen with powdered sugar on the counter, figuring out if there was something worth building from the wreckage of how they'd met. There was something. They both knew it, and neither of them said it directly, because neither of them was the kind of person who moved faster than the thing warranted. But it was there, present and patient, the kind of beginning that doesn't announce itself but simply shows up and waits to be noticed. She left at 9:30. He walked her to the door and she put her coat on and paused with her hand on the door frame. "Next time," she said, "I cook." "You cook?" "Also badly," she said, "but I've been told I make good soup." He held the door. She went out and he heard her footsteps down the hallway and then the elevator and then nothing. He stood in his doorway for a moment. The apartment was quiet behind him, with Lily's sleeping child quiet, full and warm and particular. He thought about what Lily had said before she dropped off to sleep. "You seem different." He thought about what different meant, what had changed in the 11 days since a woman in a ball gown had pressed a folded note into his hand and said, "Please," without saying the word. The honest answer was, not much had changed. He was still the same man he'd been. Same apartment, same job, same daughter, same reconstructed knee. Same old reflex of noting exits and counting people in a room. Same tendency to stand near doors. But Sophia had said it, and now Lily had said it, and maybe what they were both picking up on wasn't a change, but a return. The slow arrival of something he'd sent away because he'd thought he needed to. And that had come back not because of the gala or Whitmore or any of it, but because he'd finally stopped insisting that the person who had done those things, and the person who dried dishes and made pasta and sat on the edge of his daughter's bed, were 2 different people who couldn't exist in the same life. They were the same person. They had always been. He went back inside, locked the door, checked on Lily. Still asleep, the stuffed rabbit under her arm, her braid half undone against the pillow. He stood in her doorway for a moment, the way he always did. The way that never got ordinary, no matter how many times he did it. Then he went to the kitchen and cleaned up the powdered sugar from the counter and turned off the light and went to bed. He slept better that night than he had in longer than he could specifically account for. No particular reason, just the accumulated small weights of the last several weeks settling somewhere manageable, and the apartment warm around him, and the knowledge that tomorrow was Sunday, and Lily would want waffles, and he knew where the waffle iron was. Small things, the right size for a life. 3 months later, on a Friday evening in January, Mason sat at a conference table in a federal building and gave the first of what would be several depositions in the case against Richard Calloway. He answered questions for 4 hours, carefully and completely, with the same direct precision he'd brought to every statement before this one. The case was solid. Webb told him so afterward, in the hallway, in the clipped way that federal attorneys conveyed good news. Not celebrating, just informing. The financial evidence from Gerald Foss's drive had been corroborated by 6 weeks of forensic accounting. 3 of Calloway's co-conspirators had entered cooperation agreements. The deputy city comptroller had turned state's witness in exchange for a reduced sentence and had provided documentary evidence that expanded the scope of the charges considerably. The state senator's chief of staff had resigned and was facing his own proceedings. The criminal network Calloway had built over 6 years was coming apart the way such networks always ultimately came apart, from the inside, as each person within it calculated their own survival and decided that loyalty to a man in handcuffs was not a sound investment. Mason took the elevator down from the federal building and walked out into January, which was cold in the specific punishing way of that city in that month, and found Victoria waiting on the steps with her coat collar turned up and 2 paper cups of coffee from the cart on the corner. She handed him one. "How was it?" she asked. "Long." He drank the coffee. It was too hot and exactly what he needed. "Webb seems confident." "He is." She fell in beside him as they started walking. No particular destination, just out of the cold wind and into the slightly less cold street. Gerald's testimony from last week apparently closed the last open question on the financial chain. Good. They walked for half a block in comfortable quiet. The city was doing its January thing, heads down, coats tight, everyone moving with purpose towards somewhere warmer. "I have a board meeting Monday," Victoria said. "We're voting on the new COO appointment." "Who?" "Someone I've known for 11 years who has never once in that time done anything I didn't trust." She paused. "My father would have approved of her. He had a sense about people." A beat. "So do I, it turns out. It just took me a while to trust it." Mason looked at her sideways. She was looking straight ahead, at the street, at the city, at something that was probably further away than either of those. "He'd have approved of a lot of what you've done," Mason said. "Since?" She didn't answer right away. He didn't rush it. "I think about that sometimes," she said finally, "whether what I'm building is what he would have wanted or what I want, whether those are the same thing or different." A pause. "I've started to think the answer is that it doesn't matter anymore. What he built was his. What I'm building is mine. The thread between them is real, but I don't have to follow it exactly." She glanced at him. "Someone told me once that being able to do something doesn't mean you have to. It just means you have a choice." He almost stopped walking. "I said that about something else." "I know, but it applies to more than one thing." She shrugged, a small, deliberate movement. "I'm repurposing it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was definitely something. They reached the corner. His car was a block south. She was going in the opposite direction. "Saturday," she said. "You said you'd let me cook. You said you make good soup." "I didn't say good. I said I've been told it's good. There's a distinction." Now I'm less confident. "You should be," she said, entirely seriously. "It's a complicated soup." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the expression he'd been learning over 3 months, the one that was both direct and slightly deflective at the same time. The expression of a person who said things plainly but left room around them for the other person to decide what to do. "Saturday," he said. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, she said. She went her way. He went his. The city was cold and indifferent and enormous, and he walked through it the way he walked through everything, noting exits, counting blocks, present in the specific unremarkable moment of a Friday afternoon in January, and felt for the first time in a long time no particular urgency to be anywhere other than exactly where he was going. Home. Lily. A drawing on a refrigerator, a stuffed rabbit and a candy rule, and a second-best purple sweater. These were not small things. They had never been small things. He just needed long enough to stop treating them like they were.